All right, I just wanted to share a little bit about this whole area of Abba Father. There's been a lot where people say that this is like saying daddy or papa. And so you'll hear a lot of people talking about Papa God, or even when they pray, they'll say daddy or something like that. Um, the word Abba is definitely a term of intimacy and endearment. So it was a term of that sense that, yeah, you are my father, my loving father, my caring father. But when we consider Jesus' prayer in Matthew 6:8, I think it's on here. It says, therefore, do not be like them, for your father knows the things that you have need of before you ask. In this manner, therefore, pray, our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So Jesus clearly using the term father as one who loves his children, one who cares about his children. And he teaches us to pray, not to pray daddy, but to pray father, and then hallowed be thy name. In other words, Jesus is stressing the sacredness and holiness of the Father and of his name. So I think to try and reduce it down to daddy or papa is to lose this picture or this sense where Jesus teaches us that there is a place of holiness here, that there's a place of sacredness, and we're not just coming flippantly to God. And I think that there's a tendency, especially more and more in North America, to nobody wants to dress up for church anymore. Um, we we try and make it as casual as possible, and even in our language and in our speech, we have everything very, very casual. And in that, we're losing the holiness, the sacredness. And this is something you see when you go to a church like an Anglican church or a church that um, they have some of the liturgy and stuff like that. There's a sense of God's holiness, a sense of that fact that we need to come and in humility, we need to come and ask you for forgiveness for our sins and all those things that are so important. We don't want to lose that. Okay. And so Barnes, in his notes, he's a commentator, he says this: it is said in the Babylonian Gemara, which is part of the Talmud, a Jewish work, that it was not permitted for slaves to use the title of Abba in addressing the master of the family which they belonged. So the slaves were not allowed to use this word Abba, this word father. And so I think that that's what Paul is probably pointing at here, that we are no longer slaves, but we are sons. So we are given this privilege to speak this term of endearment to God and to do it with respect, but to use it as this sense. So in 7 of Galatians 4, it says, therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, therefore the heir of God. So now we have this opportunity to use the word Abba, as the Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And so we walk in this place. And he says, now we are heirs. Heirs means a place of favor and privilege as a child of God. As we see in 1 John 1:12, it says, as many as received him, to them he gave the right or the authority to become the children of God to those who believe on his name. So as we receive Christ, we are now made children of God, and we come into this place of authority, this place where we have certain rights as a child of God, as a son. And so this is a difference between us now. We're no longer those slaves that had no authority, no place, no ownership. They could not say Abba Father. Now we can. We have been brought into that place where we can receive Christ. All right, so this whole area of sonship is very important. We are now part of the seed of Abraham. We are now part of the heirs of God. We now have received all these blessings that have come from him. And this is a very important thing. So the next argument that he brings to us is the argument. It's called the sentimental argument, and it's found in Galatians 4:8-25. And the reason they call it a sentimental argument is it's where Paul expresses his fears. He says, "I fear that uh, you are going the wrong direction. You're missing out on the power of grace." And also talks about his relationship with the Galatians, and how that relationship progressed, for him to teach and to be, in a sense, their father in the faith. All right. So he says, "But then indeed you did not know God. You served those which by nature were not gods." So the idols, even though they were called gods with a small g, they did not have the nature of the true God. Okay. At best, they were demons. They had the authority and power of a demon, but they were not anything close to the nature and the power and the attributes that God has. And so they served these because they didn't know God. They didn't recognize him. They didn't have any idea who God was. And so they began serving these lesser gods. And these gods were deceived. They deceived them. They were deceivers. And they were caught in this deception of these gods. Now, these gods, they promised great things to them. They promised that they would protect them from floods and everything. You sacrifice to us, you sacrifice a goat, or even, in some cases, you sacrifice your son and your daughter, and we will protect you. And they promise provision. We will provide for you. We will cause the rain to come down. We will cause the harvest to come. So people were drawn into these gods and this idolatry, because they believed that if they did what the idols told them to do, they were going to be blessed and they were going to be taken care of. Well, this was part of this deception and bondage that they lived under, with idols. He says, "But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you have turned again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage?" So he says the idolatry, the things that you were involved in, were weak and beggarly. They had no power to save. Were enslaved by these carnal idols, and they enslaved you by your carnal nature. Okay, so this when he talks about here, that's literally what he's talking about. That they were slaves to idols, got into this place of slavery. So in the book of Romans, he talks about this. He says, "You do not know that to whom you present yourself slaves to obey, you are that one slave whom you obey, whether sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. But God be thanked, who through you were made slaves of sin. Though you were made slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine you delivered. Having been set free from sin, you have you became slaves of righteousness." All right. So the picture is that when we walk in sin, or if we obey idols, or if we obey the flesh, we become a slave to that. Okay? We're in bondage to those areas of our life. And so we start living out this bondage instead of living out the freedom. So Paul says that they were under these beggarly elements, the slavery to these idols, not living in the fullness of God's grace, of God's life. And it's interesting here, he puts the rites and the ceremonies of the law on the same plane as the rites of idolatry, in the fact that they both bring bondage. This is quite a statement for Paul to make, because when the Israelites came back from captivity, the Babylonian captivity, they came back with a real hatred for idols. And so they did everything to keep themselves separate from the idolatrous world. They had nothing to do with idols. They were very, very strict about that. But the problem was they didn't really walk in relationship to God. They just substituted almost an idolatry for the law. And So they came under this law, and their whole focus was on keeping the law, the righteousness that comes through the law, everything to do with the law. So this is why when Jesus came, they couldn't receive him. They couldn't accept him. They were bound by this idolatry to the law. And so Paul is speaking then to the Galatians. He's saying, when you go back to these weak and beggarly elements, you left the bondage of idolatry, but you're just going under the bondage of the law. Same thing is happening. And they're weak and beggarly because they cannot bring salvation, cannot give any spiritual riches. They only bring poverty to the spirit. And so he's appealing to these Galatians. You've tasted the riches, you come under the riches of grace. Why would you ever want to go back under these elements of flesh, negative things? So now he outlines a little bit of what these things were. He says, you observe days and months and seasons and years. And so the Jews they had many Sabbaths, they had many festivals to observe, and they would get involved in these, and they had to keep these all through the year. Okay, so they had a calendar, and they were always following their calendar, and they had to plan ahead. Many times, the males at least would have to pack up, and they would have to head to Jerusalem for these feasts. And so their whole life was around these feasts and preparing for these feasts and making sure they had the lambs for the sacrifices and all the things that they needed. And so there's a constant observation of these times and seasons. Colossians, it says, let no one judge you food or drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath, which are a shadow of the things to come and not the substance. Substance is of Christ. So if you think of a picture of a candle, and the candle is there, and then the light is shining from the candle against an object, and then behind the object is the shadow. What is there in that shadow?
Darkness.
Darkness. That's right. So basically, nothing. The shadow is an absence of light. Paul is saying all these festivals and new moons and Sabbaths and days and weeks and months are basically darkness. They're empty. They just are a reflection or an image of, excuse me, what is real. So the Old Testament, all the things of the Old Testament were pointing to the reality of Christ. Now that you've come to the reality, what good is the shadow anymore? The shadow goes away, and we now live in the light, live in the truth. So he says, I'm afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. And Paul's fear was that their turning back to law would cancel all the work of grace that had done in their life. For grace had set them free, brought them out of bondage, walking into liberty as the sons of God. And now they'd gone back to the law, and that was canceling the very thing that they had received. And so that was Paul's great concern. So he says, brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You have not injured me at all. So Paul, when he came to Christ, he gave up his customs. He counted his attainments in Judaism as if they were dung. And he's urging the Galatians to do the same. Come and live in liberty. Okay, as we mentioned at the beginning, these false teachers had told lies about Paul, that he was going back to the old ways, that he was teaching that people should be circumcised and all these things. And Paul is answering very strongly. He says, no, that's not true. If I or an angel of God come and preach any gospel unto you other than which we have preached, let him be accursed. That was Paul's attitude towards this. So he says, there's no way I'm going back. I want you to follow my example. I'm living in the freedom. I'm living in the freedom. I have cut myself off from all those old things, the old ceremonies, the old ways of doing things, living in the freedom of the grace of Christ. And I want you to do that. So that's Paul's heart. His heart for the Galatians, heart for them that they would do that. Praise God. So that wraps up our lesson for today. I want to mention that next week we won't be having a lesson. I have a bunch of things that are going on next week, so I won't be able to do the lesson next week. So we will skip a week and we'll be back the week after to continue on. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Yes.